It's a kind of easy word to say. World is more difficult. Valendo, buongiorno, bom dia, good morning, bonjour. It's a great pleasure to receive here Cécile Malaspina and Kate Lloyd Thomas for our, I think, the sixth roundtable. Today we're going to have a conversation around material variables of adaptation and the case of intermittent strategic disadaptation. And we're going to have the opportunity also to discuss the Kate Lloyd Thomas last book. It's a forthcoming book, and Cecile has been discussing with Katie. And I'm going to introduce first of all Cecile. She's going to make a presentation called Simondon and the Birds of the Apocalypse: Rethinking the Relation Between Raw Nature and Raw Material and Technicity in the Apocalyptic Times. And then we're going to have Kate Lloyd Thomas' presentation. Cécile Malaspina is a philosopher based in London. She's the author of An Epistemology of Noise, Bloomsbury 2018, and principal translator of Gilbert Simondon's On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, University of Minnesota Press 2017. She's director of the program at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, and her program is hosted by King's College London, where she is a visiting research fellow. She's a member of the editorial board of the Science journal, Puis Descartes, and Science book series at the Presse de Paris Nanterre. She's contributing editor of Angelaki, commissioning editor at Copy Press, and guest editor at Nature, Humanities and Social Science Communications. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Cecile, and also Kate Lloyd Thomas. Please, if you'd like to start, it would be a pleasure. Thank you. The mic is yours.
Okay. Sorry, how do I go back? Now I see you all again. Yeah, thank you very much. You don't have feedback now that the others are off, no? It's okay. Good. So we're not going to talk about disadaptation today because that was an initial proposition I had made, but then we had a longer chat with Katie and we found other crossovers that seemed more urgent and more imminent, and I hope that's going to become apparent after our two presentations. So I am going to be talking about Simondon and the Birds of the Apocalypse. And the focus of my talk, it will emerge in the latter third of the talk, is the concept of nature as raw nature in relation to the idea of raw material and technicity in apocalyptic times, if you like, as we're living now. So I'm going to read this, and I also have a couple of images to show you, but because PowerPoint always confuses me, I'm going to show these when I start referring to the images. So, tradition has long considered man a singularity in nature, with the power to dominate and the right to exploit nature to his advantage. And I say that on purpose. Today, however, man's place seems no longer to be at the apex of the natural order, but at the epicenter of its unfolding disaster. With melting ice caps, the collapse of the world's water towers, and fire tornadoes, the very idea of man stands exposed as responsible for scarring our geological age. As the doomsday clock strikes 100 seconds to midnight, demands grow for the white man to recognize his place among fellow humans and other species. Only, here we encounter a paradox. A new innocence seems required for the harmonious dwelling in nature, yet it is also mankind's technical and scientific ingenuity that is tasked with seeing our own and other species through this ecological crisis. In what follows, I will work through this paradox by revisiting two contrasting motifs that run through Gilbert Simondon's writing. Plato's demiurgic vision of man as the great craftsman, and St. Francis' Sermon of the Birds, an image of man at one with the cosmos and at home in nature, as one among the species. So I'm going to briefly stop talking, show you the image, switch off the image, continue talking. So wait, you are here. Allow. Now this and this. So here is an image of William Blake's depiction of Ancient of Days, which has been interpreted by some as a depiction of the demiurge. And here is an image of by Berlinghieri of the Sermon of the Birds, showing St. Francis giving his sermon to the birds. So I'm going to switch this back off. So, because it's much nicer to see other faces when you talk than to talk to your computer screen. These distinct images of man, the demiurge and the sermon to the birds, can both be traced back to what Simondon calls the ethical vision of man. In his 2 lessons on animal and man, Simondon includes the Timaeus in his critique of a historical lineage of the ethical vision of man. Recognizing this lineage will lead us to a surprising connection between the ethical image of man and Simondon's critique of technocracy and the mode of existence of technical objects. This critique, as it turns out, is not one of technology, but of a mythical relation to techniques that goes back to the ethical image of man in the Timaeus, in Plato's Timaeus. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Simondon's favorable mention of St. Francis in his 2 lessons, and also in individuation in light of form and information. However, I'm going to be reading Simondon against the grain, in a way against himself, for himself and against himself, to reveal how his critique of the ethical image of man does not, after all, exempt the iconic Sermon of the Birds. To this end, I will emphasize the fundamental role that the legend of St. Francis played in the 13th century apocalyptic canon. It will become apparent that both the Timaeus and the Sermon of the Birds partake in mythical systems of thought that are structured around dichotomies. In light of the inclination to hierarchical and dichotomic thinking inherent in the ethical image of man, which is what Simondon critiques, we can rethink of the anthropological cut between man and nature, which ecological thinking today seeks to overcome. However, we will see that the same critique applies also to today's apocalyptic visions of the Anthropocene. Stark visions of the world before and the world after, in fact, present us with a moral ultimatum, not unlike that of the 13th century, one where we have to choose between annihilation or a new innocence and modesty of mankind, living in harmony with nature and among the species, like St. Francis thought to do in the Sermon of the Birds. Now, without denying the urgency of the climate crisis, and without euphemizing the role of capital, we will see that Simondon points to an alternative way of thinking about man's place in nature and among the species, eschewing the logic of moral dichotomies. The second part of this article will thus seek a possible line of resolution of the paradox between innocence and technical ingenuity, in Simondon's reconceptualization of nature and in his audacious conception of human nature. So I'll start by talking about the link between the Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus, and Simondon's critique of technocracy. So to begin with, let me return to Plato's Timaeus and to the status that this seminal text has in Simondon's 2 lessons on animal and man. Conceived in the divine image, Plato placed man at the pinnacle of what Simondon called a monstrous yet genius theory of evolution, where every living creature descends from man as if by degradation, And I quote Simondon here from the two lessons. The idea of the Timaeus, which is in a sense monstrous and in a sense genius, is the first theory of evolution in the Western world. Only it is a reverse theory of evolution. Man is amongst all the other animals, and by simplification, man is first among all the other animals, and by simplification, by degradation, implies that through the development of certain aspects of the human body, such as claws replacing fingernails, one can obtain a certain animal adapted for a specific lifestyle. End of quote. Today, the vision of man as pinnacle of evolution has lost its shine. We can see, however, that the mythical and theological dimensions of this vision go back beyond Darwinist accounts of evolution to a moral blueprint already contained in the Timaeus. For the Timaeus inaugurates not merely a logic of progressive adaptations, it is also first and foremost a myth that determines man's place in nature within an ethical but also explicitly political perspective. In fact, the Timaeus dialogue is prompted by Socrates, who is concerned with understanding the perfect state, not as an ideal state, but in its dynamic nature. Socrates wants to understand how the ideal society behaves when it is in crisis. Timaeus, in turn, answers with a mythological account of cosmogenesis, whereby a divine craftsman constructs the cosmic soul, steering and regulating chaotic matter through an intelligible form or intelligible paradigm. Human rationality, by this account, is the participation of man's intellective soul in the eternal intellect. It leads man to recognize and preserve the eternal principles of order underpinning perpetual flux. Plato's exaltation of intelligence thus becomes the foundation of a moral view of man. The Timaeus teaches us that, I quote, to destroy a structure of beauty and goodness is a mark of evil, end of quote. However, it is also in this moral principle that we find the anthropological cut. For unlike the eternal intellect, man's intellective soul is embodied and subjected to the mortal soul, which merely animates the material body. Thus embodied, the human intellect is impure and morally compromised, as it is chained to necessity and to the fluctuating states of pain, confidence, fear, and not least, pleasure, which Plato calls, I quote, evil's most potent lure, end of quote. We begin to see the moral foundation of man as a singularity in nature, and of his destiny as the great craftsman emulating the great demiurge. We can now contextualize Simondon's caution against intemperate technocracy in his mode of existence of technical objects. For Simondon, contemporary society knows only two values for the technical object it produces: outright rejection of the technical object from the sphere of culture as a mere utility, or the absolute value of the sacred object, whereby we treat technology as a modern filter or magical solution or magical potion. Technology has today realized technological feats once dismissed by Simondon as purely mythical and imaginary, and I quote, purely mythical and imaginary. Algorithms are now charged with, I quote, dominating man's peers. Deep learning neural networks are bringing us ever closer to what Simondon called thinking machines. And synthetic biology has all but achieved the first living machines. Should we say then that Simondon was wrong? Yes, if you consider only the technical possibilities. No, if you emphasize the mythical hopes invested in these new technologies. Simondon accurately diagnosed the temptation to hide behind technology. This need not be futuristic visions of post-human life, of man delivered from the drag of the mortal soul. More mundane examples abound. Only recently, the Prime Minister of a Western nation shirked responsibility for a scandal by blaming, I quote, a mutant algorithm. Now that everybody doesn't know who I mean. what is certain is that both idolatry of technology and its blanket moral rejection fall short of adequately discerning the place of Homo faber and Homo digitalis among the other species and in nature. Presented as an ultimatum in the context of the climate crisis, these alternatives instead testify to an enduring system of thought entrenched in dichotomy, affecting contemporary narratives around the climate crisis and humanity's future on Earth. So now I'm going to say a little bit about the ethical vision of man from what appears to be the opposite perspective, but the two actually join. Let us now look at the ethical vision of man and its only apparent opposition to the technocratic myth of man. In the two lessons on animal and man, Simondon presented his students with a historical frieze, beginning with Socrates' loss of interest in the observation of physical reality. Socrates is given the dubious honor of being the first who is in a certain sense responsible, I quote, for traditional dualism, between man and nature. End of quote. Turning his back on Anaxagoras' philosophy of nature so as to look inward, Socrates gives rise to the narrative of man's singularity on the grounds of his moral conscience. From here, the systematization of this anthropological cut takes its course, opposing man and nature, even when reversing this opposition. And this goes from the Timaeus to the Sophists' dictum that man is the measure of all things, from the Christian apologetics to Montaigne's debasement of man in comparison to the perfection of animals, and finally once more elevating man from the lowest to the noblest of creatures in Descartes' rationalist dualism. The moral tendency to dichotomy and hierarchy has two consequences. It leads to systems of thought favoring abstract dichotomies over the nuance of empirical observation, and it nurtures the Orphic yearning of escaping this world in favor of a higher destiny, with the idea, I quote, that man is of another nature and will discover his true destiny, favoring the demarcation of in-groups and out-groups, of man versus animal, of Christian versus non-Christian, of intelligent versus mechanical, etc. Socrates, Plato, the Stoics, and even Montaigne draw moral fault lines between man and animal that will eventually culminate in Descartes' mechanistic reduction of nature. Far from a tabula rasa, Descartes can thus be argued to have revived the already systematized dualism at play in Plato's Timaeus. Surveying this frieze of interlocking visions of ethical man, Simondon puts us on our guards against what he calls the historical dialectic, so kind of switching and somersaulting, that will ultimately somersault even Descartes', I quote, properly rational human soul, end of quote. Because the latter will ultimately reverse itself into the mechanized, I quote, soulless psychology of behavioral psychology in the 20th century. So the reduction in a way catches up with Descartes, with what he thought he could exempt from mechanistic reduction. So in the next section, I will focus more specifically on the Sermon of the Birds and the Birds of the Apocalypse. And I'm going to read Simondon with Simondon against Simondon, if you like, because I'm going to argue his point, but in a way contradict an exemption that he seems to make. The question is there an escape from this hierarchical vision of man? It appears that St. Francis could offer a way out for Simondon. Simondon, in fact, praises St. Francis for effacing the dichotomy between animal and man. In fact, St. Francis is praised for extending the concept of personality beyond its belonging to an in-group, to encompass its relation with the cosmos in its entirety. It is almost as if there was a good and a bad way of going about the ethical vision of man. However, I will argue against this impression that, according to Simondon's own logic, we find dichotomy and hierarchy, albeit an inverted hierarchy, also in the Franciscan worldview. To make this point, I will refer to an article by F.D. Klingender, which was written in 1958, and which analyzes the foundational role of St. Francis' Sermon of the Birds, the image I showed you earlier of St. Francis preaching to the birds in a kind of universal language, and the 13th century apocalyptic canon. So this, did I show the picture of the apocalypse earlier or not? Only St. Francis, I think. I'm going to show you the picture quickly. So it's not a very good image, but this is an image of the angel of the apocalypse and the feasting birds of the apocalypse. I'm going to describe it a little bit more in a second. So you see that it's an image that is analogous to the one that we saw before. So this is the bird of the angel of the apocalypse and the birds of the apocalypse, and this is Saint Francis and the sermon to the birds, or kind of peace and harmony with nature. So I'm back. In his article, St. Francis and the Birds of the Apocalypse, Klingender emphasizes the formal analogy between the Sermon of the Birds and the Birds of the Apocalypse. Apocalyptic imagery, he argues, was nothing less than, I quote, the imaginative vehicle of Franciscan thought, end of quote, in Northern Europe. He says, for the English illuminators of the 13th and 14th century, Michael the Angel of the Apocalypse was St. Francis. While St. Francis is represented alongside doves and sparrows, the Angel of the Apocalypse is shown amidst fierce birds, diving onto the ruins of a fallen city, or sitting on a field strewn with mangled corpses, illustrating the 18th and 19th chapter of the Revelation, of which I'll quote a little excerpt here. So this is the quote. An angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men. End of quote. The same blessing gesture represents here St. Francis and the Sermon of the Birds, and there the Angel of the Apocalypse facing the rapacious birds. The Sermon of the Birds was inextricably linked to apocalyptic visions of the 13th century spiritualist movements like those of Joachim Fiore, 1135 to 1202. It spoke to a time of political turmoil, of wars and social transformation, linked to the emergence of emergent class. The conflict between what was called the true followers of St. Francis and those who sought an alliance with the wealthy in order to establish the Franciscan order plays out the antagonism between in-group versus out-group, typical of the ethical vision of man. I'm sorry, my son just came home from school. He doesn't have the keys. 1 second. So it was the postman. So where were we? So the conflict between the true followers of St. Francis, as they were called at the time, and those who sought an alliance with the wealthy in order to be able to establish the Franciscan order, once more plays out the antagonism between in-group versus out-group, which is typical of the ethical vision of man that Simondon wants to avoid, and the dichotomies that this implies. Today, the opposition between the true followers and those who seek an alliance with the wealthy resonates with climate activists rejecting the greenwashing of industry and the attempts to justify the ideology of economic growth with investment into new technologies. Iconic images of disintegrating Arctic ice sheets and ominous fire tornadoes represent the apocalyptic horizon of the great transformation wrought by capitalism. The unclean and hateful birds of the 21st century apocalypse, however, are no longer imagined as vultures feasting on the corpses of sinners and sitting on the ruins of capital. They are domestic birds trapped in industry-scale poultry farms, acting as sentinels for the coming epidemics. The global COVID-19 pandemic is only the latest in a series of zoonotic epidemics to accentuate man's place among the species, starting with the bird flu or avian influenza. Global in scale, the COVID-19 pandemic almost immediately led to a powerful narrative featuring the apocalyptic motif of the world before and the world after coronavirus, as captured in Arundhati Roy's article, "The Pandemic is a Portal." I'm going to quote a little piece of that, a little chunk of that article now. Arundhati Roy says, I quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine a world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world." End of quote. So if ever there was a Franciscan motif, I think this is probably one. Roy's article captures the apocalyptic image of the global pandemic as a possible end to the capitalist world order, pushing back against the idea that there is no alternative to capitalism. Once more, we're confronted with a binary moral choice, or rather an ultimatum, between the end of the world as we know it or the dawn chorus of a new world. It reflects the hope that if we heed nature's lessons, this crisis may lead, if not to an age of love, then at least to an age of wisdom in which humankind will know better than to forfeit its place among the species. The question this raises at this hour of urgency in the face of global pandemics and climate chaos is this: is it even possible to avoid the dichotomies of the ethical vision of man? Is decisive action not inevitably divisive? If we have no choice but to choose sides, then why was Simondon critical of what he called the ethical vision of man? And to answer this, I'm going to sketch out what I think are 4 important nuances in his conceptualization of nature. To approach the question of man's place in nature from a Simondonian perspective, I propose we distinguish at least 4 nuances in his conceptualization of nature. In a structural sense, he speaks of nature as a regime of elements. In a functional sense, Simondon thinks of what he calls raw nature, or nature brute, as what lends itself to individuation. In a more fundamental metaphysical sense, he speaks of nature as the unlimited, the formless or infinite apeiron. This finally leads Simondon to a surprising nuance in our understanding of the nature of things according to their essence, arriving at a startling understanding of human nature. Simondon's richly faceted conceptualization of nature is not based on the dichotomies between the natural and the artificial, or between the human and other species. However, it does imply an ethics that abhors the mythical motivation of technocracy, if anything, as a misunderstanding of the technical essence, or the nature of technicity. So I start with nature brute. Simondon belongs to the great lineage of philosophers of nature. It may surprise then that he barely uses the word nature as referring to the natural world. When he does, he tends to narrow it down to a specific and localized concept, distinguishing, for instance, I quote, "a certain regime of natural elements surrounding the technical being," end of quote. However, also the technical object is characterized by a certain regime of elements, allowing it to mediate between what Simondon calls the natural world and the human world. to mediate as between two regimes of elements, like the geographical and the social. It is thus as referring to a regime of elements that Simondon first uses the word nature when he says that the technical object, and I quote, is the true mediation between nature and man. End of quote. However, following several accounts of what he calls raw matter, Simondon matière brute, Simondon at one point also speaks of a nature brute, or raw nature, to shift our understanding of nature from what is to what can be. The emphasis is no longer on the structure of a regime of elements, but on a functional understanding of nature. It is what nature is capable of that qualifies it as nature. He speaks, for instance, of the clay that will take the form of the brick mold. I quote, as raw matter, it is what the shovel raises to the surface at the edge of the marsh with roots and rush and gravel grains. End of quote. There is thus in raw matter the aptitude to become plastic in the sense of plasticity, to be transformed into a malleable material suitable for brick making. Also, a tree trunk can, in light of its raw and natural matter, as it's been translated, lend itself better to some rather than other uses in carpentry. The idea of nature brute is thus close to the specificity that characterizes raw matter, but it also has an emphasis that links it to the more general idea of the pre-individual, wherein processes of individuation may arise. Simondon uses this expression, nature brute, only once in Individuation in Light of Information and Form, which Taylor Atkins translates as bare nature. This expression here intervenes at a critical point to qualify man's place among his peers. I quote, the collective is what results from a secondary individuation relative to vital individuation, since it takes up what the first individuation had left unused of bare nature in the living being. Bare or brute nature, whatever, nature brute. End of quote. The individual, or a multitude of individuals, can thus be considered according to the capability to act as ground for an ulterior individuation at the collective level. This second individuation of the collectivity is what Simondon calls transindividual, provided it is considered in light of its dynamical conception of raw nature, as joining up the inventive capabilities inherent in these individuals, rather than compiling fixed identities, needs, or beliefs. We have to remember how the idea of nature brute builds up from a dynamical understanding of raw matter. Raw or bare nature is whatever lends itself to individuation in its specificity. It's what endows a reality with a specific aptitude to participate in ulterior processes of individuation. As a consequence, it is not what is, but the power to become. Put in Spinozist terms, one could say that nature brute emphasizes the generative capacity of natura naturans, but without dismissing the specificity that lies in the form of a natura naturata. The raw nature of physical and chemical individuation may thus lend itself to biological individuation, just as what is left undetermined in biological individuation may act as ground for psychosocial individuation, and so forth. The human is here considered not under the aspect of what he is, or what she is, or what they are, but as what they can be. To return to the technical object, we can now say that Simondon speaks of the technical object when he says the true mediation between nature, when he calls it the true mediation between nature and man, not only referring to nature as a regime of elements, but also as a specific functional capability of individuation. In other words, we can think of the technical object as a man-made relay or transformer of nature, of a man-made relay or transformer of nature's specific capability to individuate. It allows us to join up the raw nature inherent in both human and non-human individuals. So I'm coming to nature as the apeiron. This finally leads me to the most fundamental use Simondon makes of the term nature, without which this functional understanding of nature brute remains inadequate. With Anaximander's concept of the apeiron, the unlimited or the indeterminate, there does not seem to be a subtly different emphasis. I think I made a mistake here. There does seem to be a subtle emphasis, difference in emphasis. If the pre-individual points in the direction of individuation, you could say that the apeiron points to a primordial indivision and indeterminacy. So yes, there is a subtle difference in nuance here. They're not the same. I made a mistake here. It's not. Now, without consideration of the apeiron as the infinite and the indeterminate, it is impossible to understand the caveat in Simondon's conception of the nature of things and of human nature in particular. When he speaks of human nature, Simondon specifies that this word, nature, may designate, I quote, the remainder of what is original, prior even to the humanity that constitutes man, end of quote. It thereby designates as essential what remains tributary to the indeterminate and the infinite within us. Human nature could thus be said to be indeterminate in essence rather than contingently. So this is a massive move away from Aristotle, even more fundamental than the critique of hylomorphism, I think. In other words, what is universal to all humans is not a distinguishing quality or characteristic shared necessarily by all humans, but rather the primordial indivision of being to which all individuals, human or otherwise, remain tributary. By thus linking human nature to the apeiron, Simondon allows for a profound rebalancing of classical ontological conceptions of essence. Now, what does this mean for the relation between nature and the technical object? In light of the fundamental role of the apeiron for collective individuation and for a society to be transindividual, we can now understand Simondon's optimistic vision of the technical object as, I quote, the true mediation between nature and man, end of quote. But only if we think of the technical object as a man-made access to the apeiron. And I quote Simondon. There is something of human nature in the technical being, in the sense that this word nature, and he puts nature in quotation marks, nature could be used to designate the remainder of what is original, prior even to the humanity that constitutes man. Man invents by putting to work his own natural material or support, this apeiron, which remains attached to each individual being. End of quote. And I'm concluding now with the last few words. The technical object, then, is an inventive relation with different regimes of being, mobilizing the capability of raw material to lend itself to ulterior individuations. The evolution of the universe, no less than the geological evolution of our planet and its biosphere, can be understood as a spontaneous mise en œuvre of the apeiron, a sprawling of individuations according to the dynamical rhythm of a nature brute, and with a cadence each time specific to the raw matter at play. The difference with the evolution of technical objects is that the latter engages not evolution's slow time of spontaneous differentiation and selection, but that of invention. It is thus by an extraordinary reversal of the common understanding of nature, and as a consequence of human nature, that Simondon leads us to understand our place among the other species as tributary to the primordial indivision of the apeiron. We can now begin to rethink man's place in nature among the other species according to a paradigm that eschews systematic dichotomies, a paradigm that does not imply from the outset a politics of opposing in-groups and out-groups, but the possibility of a society that is based on what remains open in us and capable of invention. Having said this, Simondon does not conceive of us as orphans of the apeiron, indifferently cut from the same cosmic fabric. By reviving the medieval dispute concerning the principle of individuation, Simondon's philosophy of nature also asks us how something becomes this, such that the individual can never be reduced to its common nature. Human nature may harbor the infinite and the indeterminate, but there is, in addition to this essence, the individual's existence as a unique and singular individual here and now. Simondon thereby restores the dignity to the individual that it had lost in both Leibniz and Spinoza's philosophy. To think about human nature and about the relation between human and other species through the lens of individuation must give us a sense of the absolute uniqueness of our terrestrial world and of the individuals of our own and other species, alongside whom we collectively reinvent our place in nature. Thank you very much.
Amazing, amazing, Cécile. Thank you so much. You brought the ethical project in the center, so the core, and also this relation between human and nature. For me, as an anthropologist, is so rich, and I guess we have plenty of food for thought, as we say. And be a pleasure to hear now Kate Lloyd Thomas, and then we can have space for our discussion, comments, and questions. I would like to introduce Kate Lloyd Thomas, which is a professor of theory and history of architecture at Newcastle University. Her publications include Material Matters 2007 with Thilo Emhoff and Nick Beach, Industries of Architecture 2015, and Building Materials, Material Theory and Architectural Specification, Bloomsbury, forthcoming. Kate is the UK PI for the Anglo-Brazilian project Translating Ferro, Sérgio Ferro, if I'm right, Transforming Knowledge, which used Sérgio Ferro's work to catalyze a new field of production studies. There's a website, and Kate's presentation is entitled Simondon's Preliminary Operations, Preparations for Building in the Architectural Specification. Please, Kate, the mic is yours. You're mute, my dear.
Better. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the introduction, Thiago, and to having me, and an amazing paper to listen to from Cécile as well, and hopefully to make some connections. And this is going to be a much more sort of prosaic look at building materials. And I just wanted to say at the start that it's kind of an amazing cycle to be in. This is the first time I think I've ever spoken to an audience who know Simondon's work and are engaging with Simondon's work. I mean, at least to my knowledge. And Cécile was one of the first people that I ever talked to about Simondon's work when I first encountered it, when we were both students at Middlesex University. So it's kind of amazing to be back here with her again now, talking about Simondon. So I'm just going to share the screen. As an architect, I'm going to have lots of slides. It's inevitable. So 1 minute. So now all I can see is my screen. Are you seeing my screen? Just to check.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank
Great.
you.
Okay. It's slightly unnerving. Yeah. So this is, of course, always we change the titles, don't we, of of what we're talking about. So the title today is very close to the title of the book that's about to come out, Building Materials, Simondon Material Theory and the Architectural Specification. And yeah, just so that you're very clear, my background's in architecture. So this is the book, which will come out hopefully at the end of this year or very early next year. And it's not at all evident from the title or from the cover that it draws very heavily on Simondon's work to build a theory of materials as they're used in building. But if you have a look at the table of contents, it might become more obvious. The book uses the architectural specification, which is the written description of materials and quality of work, which usually accompanies the drawing. So we could say, if you like, that the specification is the kind of the description of matter or materials, and the drawing is the description of form. And the book's structured to follow the encounter of these documents with Simondon's thought. The chapters move via examples of timber, concrete, and glass specification, and from his critique of hylomorphism to his accounts of individuation as relation to technical object systems and invention in the final chapter. And just to say as well that it was really important to me in the book, not sort of that Simondon's philosophy didn't come first and was then somehow applied to thinking about the specification, or indeed the other way around. So the idea in the book is that the sort of the problems and the kind of resolutions and the moves forward sort of emerge together in relation to each other. So why turn to Simondon? And I think in the first place, Simondon's work provided for me an account of materials that would understand them as themselves built, as something constructed, not really as raw matter at all. And my concern was with the very limited way that architecture conceives of building materials, often simply as one material that can be selected over another, or as a kind of an instance of matter that can be shaped by form. So just to take one example, we can look at this very nice book, Materials for Architectural Design by Victoria Ballard Bell. And you can see the way that she's split up the materials into these kind of 5 categories or genus, and then we can, if we look within the category wood, we can see what very different sorts of materials get included in that single category. And perhaps bearing in this mind this kind of idea about nature that Cecile's just set up for us. So here, for example, is a canopy built out of bamboo, and it's built just after the bamboo is harvested. So the tiny image on the right shows someone spraying the bamboo for it to retain its flexibility so that it can be bent into this lattice. So it's almost kept just as it was. And also in this category of wood is what's obviously a wood product. This is ply, which has to go through a series of industrial processes to appear in regular standard sheets, and has to use loads of glue as well to transform it into this material. And I'm cheating a little bit here because this example is not actually in the book. But it's something even more contemporary of a kind of wood effect material. So this is a composite material where wood's been engineered with resins and other materials to perform in myriad ways against its nature. It can allow light through it. It can provide measurable, quantifiable levels of acoustic insulation in the concert hall where needed. Our students in architecture, and in fact some architectural writers, will often tell us they choose wood as a material because it is natural. Naming each of these materials wood as this kind of supposedly natural material hides the very different ways that they have been prepared, the regimes that make their production possible, their provenance, extraction, the labour processes involved, their effects, and perhaps even their ontological status, just what kinds of things they are. So I suppose the question is how to find other ways to think about these materials that would reveal more about them. So I first encountered Simondon's example of moulding a wet clay brick via John Protavi's book, Political Physics, around when I met Cécile, in fact. And as you know, Simondon's extended and exquisite 50-page description of brick moulding appears in the Form and Matter chapter in L'Individu et sa jeunesse physico-biologique, which is actually the book which I mainly, the one that I owned, the version I owned and read. So the one from 1964. And again, in fact, more briefly at the end of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. First, Simondon's redescription of what appears to be a paradigmatic instance of hylomorphism of form-shaping matter recasts it as a dynamic and energetic system in which the mould merely operates as a limit rather than as a hierarchical imposition by an external force. And most commentators, including Deleuze and Guattari, and importantly for me, the architectural theorists who've been drawn to Simondon's work, such as Lars Spoybreck or Brian Masumi, have mostly been interested in these dynamic operations, what Simondon calls dynamic operations within the account. But of particular interest to me, and not to my knowledge remarked upon in the Simondon literature, though some of you may know otherwise, are the processes which Simon describes which take place prior to the dynamic operations and make both clay and the mould ready for their encounter. As Simondon points out, it's the specific plastic and colloidal properties of clay that enable it to take form in moulding, and Cécile's already referred to this. Clay must be prepared through another long, technically defined and intentional chain of processes, which include drying it, grinding it, filtering it, adding water, rolling it, and kneading it. Simondon calls these the preliminary operations, which make matter and form converge towards a common operation. So he shows that clay, a material at first seeming to be a paradigmatic instance of matter, is prepared and constructed towards this specific encounter with the mould. It's not simply a material to be formed or built with, but is a material that is itself built. These preliminary operations create the conditions, his term, for individuation and the possibility that there can be an encounter between clay and mould. They make a material ready for something particular. In this case, it may be the forming of clay into a very difficult word to say, parallelepiped form, but we can imagine that in other technical systems, the preliminary operations could prepare a material for other kinds of encounter. We might consider a material not so much as a raw given substance that's available for any operation, but as a condition that has been prepared for mobilization in a specific building context. So while Simondon makes his own process-oriented redescription of moulding the wet clay brick, this is entirely, I presume, his own, all in his own words, and so on, I turn in my research to found examples which are drawn from the architectural specification. There's no time here to talk about the specification in detail, but the book does so in at great length. Because the specification goes through many changes in its organization, its form and contents. But for sake of simplicity here, let's say it's the document which prescribes the materials and quality of workmanship, often written by architects and often by others. And for around 200 years, the specification included what I call process-based descriptions of making up and using materials of site. So these are descriptions which perhaps have something in common, and certainly seem to me to have something in common with Simondon's redescription of the moulding of the clay brick. So, for example, throughout the 19th century, you'll see many clauses like this for mortars. They describe on-site operations of storing, measuring, mixing and working materials, with occasional references to off-site processes, such as here of taking the sand from the River Thames, and have this similarity to Simondon's account of preparing clay. These accounts are not limited to processes carried out by hand. In later specifications, this one's from 1960s, recipes for concrete and details of how it and its formwork are to be handled and worked are given in increasing detail, as for example in this specification for the concrete at the Elfrida Rathbone School, which was built by the London County Council. So you can see here that we're just getting a mechanised description now of the mixing of the concrete that has some similarity to the description of mixing the mortar. Concrete specifications also reveal the extent to which both formwork, or the mould, and concrete are prepared to resist and counter the so-called natural processes which would take place if the concrete mixture was simply poured into the mould. So the building that you're looking at here is one of the earliest reinforced concrete houses to be built in Britain by the architect Val Harding. And in fact, it gets an incredibly detailed description of the processes of making concrete, perhaps in part because Harding sort of longed to be close to the processes, or perhaps more practically because this was a very new set of techniques, and it really is a sort of series of instructions for a builder who may not have encountered these methods before. And if you look at clause 106 here, I'll just read it. Form the dead weight of the concrete without any constructional loads, without excessive deflection. So what's being described here is the way that the formwork, although it would naturally kind of bulge when you poured in this great heavy liquid concrete, it's got to be braced to keep to the sort of rigid lines of the architect's drawing. And in the next one that looks at the external finish, you can see too that it's being described the concrete sort of natural sweating that it has when it's setting in the mould, and you get this kind of pot-marked surface. That must be kind of rubbed away, sanded away, so that the concrete appears perfectly smooth. So here we can say that the kinds of operations involved in the production of these concrete formations have been designed to sort of, they're sort of remedial, that they're kind of, they're thinking very carefully about how we can reproduce the idea of the architect, even sort of against what the concrete will do during its dynamic operations. But we might also say, going back to Simondon, that there's an attempt here to bring into relation those ideas, those sort of orthogonal abstract ideas of the architect into relation with the concrete, with the matter itself, through the technical operation. In Simondon's description, we really only hear about the literal physical manipulations of clay and mould. But when we start to look at specifications for concrete production, all sorts of other kinds of extra physical processes enter into the descriptions. So here, this is the Elfrida Rathbone School, built in the 1960s. In fact, only the roof here of the 2 assembly halls is concrete. Most of the building is brick, but nevertheless, there are about 16 pages of prose, very, very detailed description of the concrete forming processes. So, for example, in this specification, we see references to the monitoring processes of the architect and contractor in clause C2. So we start to see these kind of these figures and their practices entering into the preparations for concrete production. And in C10, even the workman's lunch break is incorporated into the clause that concerns the care to be taken when cleaning out the mixer. So these descriptions remind us that many more processes are involved in making materials ready for building than the physical operations Simondon describes. They alert us to labour, legislation, quality control, testing and measurement, to the myriad of organisational and industrial processes that prepare a material for its deployment in building. To understand these, we need to include the extra physical as part of the preliminary operations, which create the conditions for materials emergence and mobilization. So this is kind of part 3, and we turn to a new type of description that's found in the architectural specification. For reasons I won't go into here, process-based description that we've just seen has largely been superseded in today's specifications. They first appeared in the early days of the capitalist building industry in Britain in the late 18th century, and their phasing out started in the early 1970s. Nowadays, a new form of materials description dominates, which is called in the industry performance-based specification. And as the architectural technologist Ian Chandler explains here, this type of description describes a material by what it's to do and how it's to behave after placement. And I argue this is a radical reconception of a building material. We're no longer understanding a material as a product of a recipe and a process of making before during building. Rather, the material is conceived in terms of what it will do after building. And indeed, in the performance specification, the material as a substance, as a named substance, as something which is made, is irrelevant as long as it meets the performance criteria. So these specifications look quite different. They use the units and quantities of material science and more or less omit the naming of the materials themselves. So in the set that you can see here, which is actually, I've taken all the quantities out. The architect asked me to do that. It's for curtain walling in a supermarket. It's immediately clear that the whole description is configured around the specific functional criteria the glazed walling is to achieve, such as integrity, air permeability, thermal properties, acoustic properties, and so on. And indeed, today, this way of thinking about materials in terms of performance is now engineered into materials kind of during their making, and particularly in the case of glass. So here you can see this is from Pilkington's website, and their different kinds of glass are being described by benefit: thermal insulation, self-cleaning, solar control, and so on. To measure the properties and performances using the units of material science, a range of industrial practices at very large scale are needed. So it's not just that you can redescribe these materials, you have to be able to kind of quantify them in particular ways. In particular, these include techniques and scales of manufacture that produce materials which are consistent in every sample. So if you're going to be sure that a material whose performance you've quantified, that any other sample of it will also behave in exactly the same way. The materials have to be homogeneous and consistent. And in fact, some commentators call these constant materials or all-over materials. And interestingly, perhaps for our purposes, they reproduce the idea of matter and, of course, have other advantages for industrial production. And increasingly today, more and more and more materials are being, let's say, matterized in this way. But just to think about performance specification, we've got two clauses here on the left, and they're both for ashlar stone, so for stone cladding to the side of it, to the wall of a building. And on the left, you can see natural stone, and that's being specified in the traditional way. You can give its name, you can give its petrological family, even its origin, the quarry where it's going to have been extracted. On the second, on the right, you can see the specification for cast stone. So cast stone is one of these matterized materials. It's a reconstituted stone, a bit like concrete, which then can be molded. And you can see on the right that this material, it's possible to specify it in performance terms. So materials, so natural materials like stone, naturally occurring materials, have too much variegation for it to be possible to subject them really to performance specification. So in regimes where you want to performance specify materials, you're really sort of left with only some materials that you can use. It's also the case that a whole sort of range of tests have to be developed in order to see those very kind of scientific values that you saw in the performance specification. And this is one of my favorites. This is a test, there are many different kinds, for quantifying the non-slipness of a floor surface. And it's, I mean, it's almost absurd. So here, the ramp is being inclined. It's got soapy sort of solution all over it, and it's being inclined until the point where the tester slips. And yet this kind of testing is, appears just as sort of, some kind of unit in the specification. And returning to glass, this is a test that Pilkingtons use to think about the impacts of objects on their glass. So the strength of the glass and what sort of impacts it has to resist. And in this case, what we're seeing is a kind of leather punch bag, which has been filled with lead shot. And you might notice it's kind of head-shaped. And this test is particularly to think about the kind of impacts of bodies against glass. And I show this really to point out it's not enough simply to quantify the material itself, but you also need to quantify the things it's going to come into contact with. So with reference to Simondon, it's no longer a clay mold relation that's being prepared through these preliminary operations of testing and equivalence. Rather, these procedures produce the possibility of a quantitative equivalence between the material and a range of impacts. Where these impacts are from weapons of attack, the tests are yet more specific. And as we see in this table from Pilkingtons, which gives the thicknesses required for laminated glass, even guns are named in thinking about the impacts in relation to the glass. And just at this point, I want to also just think a little bit more about performance engineered glass. So you can see at the bottom, glass polycarbonate composite. So these are these new sorts of glass, engineered glass products, which are, have layers, built up films, coatings that are applied to them. in order to produce glass which has certain very highly quantified behaviours. And in the image, you can see the sort of these micro layers. I think what's interesting here is that the layers aren't described at all in terms of what they're made of, just in terms of the behaviours that they can produce. So in the case of selecting this performance engineered glass, one type over another or one size over another, the architect or specifier needs also to know something about the perceived likelihood of any of these impacts, whether footballs, bodies, guns, or bombs. These forces must themselves be quantified and evaluated. As engineer Sergio De Gaetano points out in relation to the design of a glass facade, a threat assessment is the starting point of any bomb blast evaluation. It will take into account a building's geographic location, as well as the political stability and history of terrorism in the city and in the country. Here, the techniques and practices of performance specification make possible a quantitative relationship between the state of national security and a sheet of glass. Such mediations are no longer the material relations conventionally considered in architectural discourse, such as matter and form or architect and maker, and they're a long way from the clay mould of Simondon's example. But they represent an increasing socialization of material concepts and capacities that must also be considered in terms of the industrial, economic, and legislative context and techniques which make them possible and which are increasingly pervasive. So I might actually, I think I'm going to come out of screen share now and see how I do that. Okay, have you got me back again? I think so. So this is the final section. Hopefully, it's now become evident that a premise of my book is that we think of building materials as technical objects in Simondon's sense. Certainly, this is the case for engineered glass to the extent that it's locked into regimes of testing, quantification, certification, and mass production at a large scale. And it's also true of all four of the material products to which Mark Jarzenbeck argues architects are addicted to today in the hyper-industrial world in which we live. And he calls these, he's got a great name for them. These are glass and its necessary corollary, steel, plastic, and concrete. And together he calls them the quadrivium industrial complex. These are the materials that have enabled the ever-increasing productivity and profits of the capitalist building industry, and also minoritized the use of other materials. Why is it not good enough to think of building materials as matter or as raw materials indefinitely available to be shaped by form, nothing more than selections one over another, which we architects make as specifiers? We know the answers. Producing these building materials consumes vast amounts of energy, resources are running out, and building materials are responsible for half the solid waste generated every year worldwide. We know little about the conditions in which these materials are extracted and produced, or of those who work with them, or about the systems and regimes in which they are determined and mobilized for use. So we must ask how building materials are prepared, with what, through which processes, and for what ends. But I think there's another set of issues which Simondon points us to and has a lot in common, I think, with some of the things Cecile's been talking about. In the closing chapter of on the existence of technical objects, on the mode of existence of technical objects, Simondon finally gives his own account of why we so urgently need to develop an understanding of technical objects that goes beyond their usefulness to us. We need, he argues, to find other ways to live and engage with technical objects and ensembles than estrangement and alienation. In the 20th century, he writes, the human world of technical action has once again become a stranger to the individual. When we labor with tools, we see only the end goal. Our work creates the conditions for the technical operation to unfold, but at the same time obscures it. We neither know it nor have the capacity, importantly, to intervene with it. And this seems to be ever more the case with something like the performance sort of engineered and performance specification kind of regimes that I've just been looking at. They're sort of hermetically sealed. They're not available at all to ourselves or to invention. We need, says Simondon, to develop technical knowledge which, to quote him, consists in starting from what happens inside the mould in order to find the different elaborations that can prepare it by starting from the centre. Going into the mould is for Simondon a means to know the technical operation and to come into a communicative relation with it, which of course he terms invention. For Simondon, the technical object is also the means through which humans come into relation with nature. And as Cécile has explained, we can think of the technical object as a man-made relay or transformer of nature's specific capability to individuate. It allows us to join up the raw nature inherent in both human and non-human individuals. It has the extraordinary characteristic of being both of the human and because detached and self-sufficient of nature. And as Paolo Viano has put it, technical objects also have the potential to give an external appearance to what is collective, to what is species-specific in human thought. And I failed really to come up with a closing kind of couple of sentences to this talk. But I suppose then just to sort of sum up is to say that we need ways of working with materials, of understanding materials and working with them that remain open to invention rather than closed to it. So that's the end.
It's amazing. That's amazing, Katie. Thank you so much. I mean, I guess we get a very, very interesting combination between you two. Cécile brought to us the relation between human and animals, and she brought the ethical at the core of the discussion. And Katie brought to us the materiality, which is sometimes so difficult. And it showed to us very clearly the non-hierarchical approach. There's no division between human, animals, and materials. So the relation is the important thing. So and you provided with great examples and in the speech this combination. I must say that Kate, like Thomas, for those who are listening to us, has defended her PhD in 2006, if I'm right. And she was reading Simondon for a long time. I mean, she's one of the pioneers of Simondonian thinking in Europe. And she's doing this, in French, reading the French version, as she pointed, the 64 version. And that's why, it's so interesting to see, the physical, biological, and inside her work with materiality. And it's really, really rich for us. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I would like to, please, Cécile, and we are anxious to keep listening to you.
Shall I say something? When I got the manuscript of your book, Katie, and I started reading it, I was so excited because I actually had the feeling I was reading Simondon. I think that's what's the real beauty, the real ethics of Simondon's philosophy is what you feel when you read him, which is at first really baffling. when I first picked up the first book of his that I saw was I picked off a shelf without even knowing who he was L'Individuation. And I was like, wow, it just went on and on and on and deeper in details. And it was baffling because there's no other philosopher like that to my knowledge. And this love of the fact that you can't do philosophy as a kind of floating discourse. I love that. And it's not a philosophy that substitutes itself for science, or that speaks better than science, or that explains to scientists and engineers the concepts that they use. It's a philosophy that really is permeated by the realities through which it thinks. And I loved in your book the description of this performance, one of the earliest performance specifications of wood floor that would be partially to be danced on. And it's actually also kind of cute, but it also shows the relation between regimes of elements, human and otherwise. And I just love the fact that, I guess what I want to say, what I feel is very often, if not always, swept under the carpet, is that the problem of individuation is not just one of ontogenesis in general. It's how something becomes a this, so that my cat is not just any cat, but my cat is only this cat, even if there was another one exactly like it. And this comes through the specificity, I guess, and this transition from materials in their raw state to materials that are processed, that you have already, I agree with you, I think you have a technical element in the sense that you have, the mediation between two regimes of elements, at least two. In fact, you're showing there's many more. It's a whole network of regimes of elements. I'm so excited. I'm so excited that your book exists, and I really think it's going to make a big bang in Simondon scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a little bit overwhelmed now. Thank you. Yes, I was really. One of the things that I found really interesting in Simondon's work is this sort of the tussle. Maybe you can say more about it, but with use as an idea. And there's something when you were talking, for example, about the clay, which in part it has these qualities of its own. I mean, which make it available for some kinds of operations over others, but I was also really interested in the fact that it also has to be prepared for this very specific thing, so that we already have the intention and the use for it in mind, and so there's a and I think this is one of the things that I found so interesting in that particular section, which you don't necessarily find elsewhere, because here, so I found out later that the 1964 book isn't, if you like, the real book, so that the way that the chapters go one from the other is in fact different in the more recently translated version that I now have. But I suppose it's the only point, that chapter is the only point where there's this kind of intentionality in the sort of the preparing, if you like, of the kind of the pre-individual field, and that's. And I think that helps us a lot to think about this sort of. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but the fact that the clay both has its qualities, but also that they're manipulated, prepared, edited, censored, and so on. I mean, that's yeah.
I guess if you think of the lapse of time since the writing of Simondon's mode of existence and Individuation, and now one of the greatest differences in the discussion we can have is material sciences. So I guess the fact that we can invent materials at the nano level and at other levels, I guess too, I don't know too much about chemistry, unfortunately. It makes Simondon's analysis of standardization from artisanal work to industrial work, the intelligence that's involved in standardizing tools so that they become, suddenly other things become possible. And I seem to remember that he was talking about steel or needles that come from a particular place. It reminded me of the moment that in your specifications where the sand has to be sifted from a particular place in the River Thames. Yeah, I think we are moving towards an understanding of materials as technical objects that are subject to standardization as well. To that kind of permeability of to be informed really by science also.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This integration is there are less gaps between material and technical objects, I think. The transition is smoother.
And you may be, and that's a good point, in as much as it may also, yeah, you're right, that I suppose because we're making materials in that way, we're more likely to think of them as technical objects. I suppose that's, I mean, I'm not sure whether they have become technical objects in a way that they weren't before, but we're certainly more likely to think of that way and that way and need them. And it's a disappointment to me sometimes that readers of Simondon in my field anyway always go to living materials in architecture. So what they get interested in is sort of biotechnologies and so on. So there's a sort of because it seems to me to have so much potential for thinking about non-living as well. So
I guess even there, there is biotechnology on the one hand, where you use, I presume, molecular biological processes, but then there is also this capacity now to build living automata or these kind of unicellular organisms that are literally engineered. I mean, we can't go that far with it at the moment, but it's definitely there. So even there, I feel like this question of specification and standardization and certainly, I think the metaphor that has haunted us to look at a living being as a machine is now almost turning into a completely different problem when you look at biological entities at the very primary level that can be engineered in such a way that the boundary between machine and living being is actually really problematic. But it's no longer the same thing as saying, is it? As saying that living beings are just complex machines, all based on that you could reduce to kind of basic molecular.
No, mechanisms. I suppose you design living beings to be machines. It's something like that, isn't it?
It's not the same thing for sure, but it introduces a new nuance to the metaphor or analogy between, man-made systems and spontaneously arising systems from natural evolution.
So, Cécile, can you say a bit more to us about your vision for Simondon and the current crisis? Then,
I was actually surprised where the article took me. It's under submission at the moment with Rue Descartes, and I didn't set out to write it that way. I think it was a series of kind of chance encounters. I can't even remember how I came across. I think I just Googled St. Francis and came across this wonderful article about the apocalypse and thought, hang on a second, what's going on here? So it didn't occur to me before then to think in any other way than in the way that has kind of swept us all up, which is that we are standing at the precipice of the annihilation of life on Earth, practically. I mean, there are actually some critters that would survive any kind of catastrophe, bar perhaps the implosion of Earth itself, and maybe then they would still survive on asteroids and be planted on other planets. I'm not sure, but there are some forms of life that seem to be practically indestructible. But apart from that, I think the catastrophe is really real. It's very worrying that we are in situations of extreme crisis, including the coronavirus, which is kind of immediate, but it's not quite as dramatic in a way as the consequences of global warming. And the incapacity, with the knowledge that we have, to have coordinated kind of collective action. So it does very much feel like we're in an age like the century immediately after St. Francis, where you had the impression that this is potentially the end of the world, definitely the end of the world as you knew it. And depending on how you're pulling yourself together, this is going to be hell or the beginning of something completely new. It does feel like that. But then I have to say that your book, in a way, soothes me in the sense of the argument that Simondon makes, which is that it's almost like saying, okay, don't panic, just look at it closely, like take the time to look at the reality in front of you very, very, very closely. The more specificity you can handle, the more you are actually dealing with the problem at hand. I don't know if that answers the sociological and political problem which is our main problem. I think it seems to me that we have the knowledge to solve, the knowledge and technical capability to solve at least partially and satisfactorily most of the problems that we face. How to solve the kind of moral evolution of human society in a globalized context is completely beyond me. And I also really don't understand politics at all.
But it's a very lovely formulation that you make in the paper about the paradox, and that what Simondon helps us to see is that this isn't really a paradox between the sort of, the harmonious relationship with nature and a technical and sets of technical solutions as well. I mean, I thought it was really beautiful. Anyway, I really love the arc of this paper, Cécile. So.
But I guess my question to you would be, because what you didn't talk about so much, but you hinted at it a little bit when you said there's, beyond the specifications and technical processes, that there is labor and there are human beings that have lunch, but only, that have to do certain things before they can have lunch. And obviously these people are paid or not paid well enough. And they're part of a global system that sustains our production of technical objects, including architecture and including the materials that we use for architecture. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about whether this patient understanding and also giving value to the kind of intricacy of the realities that we're creating, whether that has a kind of ethical, political dimension that can in some way answer aspects of the crisis, of the multiple kind of concerted crisis that we're going through right now.
Well, I suppose what I think is, I mean, if we just leave the problem at building materials, so we just stay with that. So I think in this particular instance, a way that we think about, so first of all, there's the way that we think about materials. So literally the way that we conceive of them, the way that we conceptualize them in architecture, but also in other domains as well, in other spheres of practice. As sort of as simply as there to do things with, to choose between one or the other, it's really problematic. I mean, we have to be able to engage, not only to understand kind of where they're from, but also what they're doing. So, and you have to, I think you have to go beyond. So in the case of performance specification, for example, let's not even think about the kind of performance materials that are being produced as well. It's a regime which starts to make it impossible to use other kinds of materials. It's a regime which upholds the quadrivium industrial complex. And if we just ignore it and just use, here's just another procedure that we can use in architecture, it's got us it's got us in its grips. We can't do anything about it. And And so architecture has, as a discipline, and again, this is going to be applicable in other spheres, really has a problem, because first of all, it concerns itself in the main with the formal, and that's through its processes of drawings or through its main techniques. And second, it has it sort of despises or denigrates or thinks beneath it any consideration of the technical. So in some way, anything which is happening at the technical level just is it just kind of escapes the notice of anybody, and so if we're going to, and there's something kind of extraordinary and astonishing that this is happening at the same time. I mean, even at the most straightforward, where you have to think about where materials come from, about resources, about extraction and so on, that you have a sort of regime of describing and thinking about materials, and in fact, which has moved the decisions anyway away from architects. Not that necessarily that matters, but you have a regime which actually makes it impossible to see. I mean, so in the days of process-based specification, you could go, the sand, it comes from, it comes from the Thames, but that's all disappeared as well. So there's a weird tension at the point where you need this kind of understanding and knowledge. It's actually being completely occluded. So and in terms of labour, I suppose, I mean, there are other questions. There are questions about understanding exploitation and all of those other things, but there are also just questions about joy, I suppose, which would be about what it could mean to, and what it has meant and what it does mean to work with materials, to build in inventive ways. It's sort of like another sort of another dimension as well. So I think of it as more as kind of more than paying attention, as a sort of a real need to change, to really change and challenge the way that we've even though the changes, I mean, these monumental sort of changes, both in terms of the specification and in the terms of the way that materials are produced, even though they've been happening, the way the discourse sort of thinks about materials has just really stayed at this level of kind of Aristotle with his bronze and his spherical mold. So, yeah.
So if I understand right, your one of your concerns with performance specification of materials adds an entire new dimension to Simondon's critique of defining technical objects according to their use. That's really quite big, I think. It's quite a big step, I would think, in taking Simondon further. The other thing that just came to my mind when I heard you speak was the parallel move from process to performance specification materials, and the move in education from thinking that you're going to give kids literacy and a general culture, and then they'll do with their life what they can and what they will, to now thinking that you have to form specific types of people for a specific type of economy, or that you will, your the outcome of this education should be people fit for employment in certain types of industries where jobs are available at the time of their education, but maybe not by the time they're finished.
Yes.
I don't know if that's,
yes.
I mean, you could to a certain extent think that the children have been probably for a long time, but as a kind of plastic mass of kind of demographic material, and education, one of the kind of specifications, either process or performance-based specification of this mass, demographic mass.
Yeah, and then there's a question of like, what are the techniques of matterizing people then, to turn them into that mass?
In standardizing.
Yeah. Your question about the performance specification is really complicated. It's quite complicated because yes, there's a way in which use then enters into the there's use is literally sort of engineered into the material in its production. What did you mean that was a big challenge to?
I mean to say that for Simondon, if you looked at technical objects and kind of categorized them by their use, for example, engines or and he felt that then you couldn't account for the different lineages of technical objects that could that could by equal right claim to be engines, but they are of a completely different nature and operate in a completely different way. So now the problem is different because you're making materials whose performance specification implies a use, like you're going to use it in an environment where there's a terror attack likely, or where you're already counting with, you're kind of making. I think when we chatted yesterday, we briefly thought about hypertele. The fact that this kind of hyper specialization of something that also impoverishes the range of what it can do. But it's a different dimension to if Simondon criticized the category of use as something that blinds us to the diversity of technical lineages. Here it's almost as if the performance specification engineers materials that blind us to the kind of generosity or capacity of that material, were it not so hyper specialized for a specific role. I guess, is that part of what you are you're thinking about? You said it holds us kind of by the neck, or it grips us. Did I understand correctly that to a certain extent this hyper specification with with a specific performance in mind, that in a way limits your range of what you can even conceive to do? That's kind of what I understood you were saying. What is it that you meant when you said it holds us by the neck?
Well, so one thing is that we have to sort of so I mean there are interesting things, like if you want to use a material, you have to demonstrate that a material performs in a certain way. Let me see if I can say this right. I think what happens is that the material still has different ways it could be used. Presumably. It's sort of so even if it's a piece of performance engineered glass, but because of the regime it sits in, you have to demonstrate sort of it has to be demonstrably able to perform. I'm not managing to say this very well. So it has to. It's only one aspect of its being, if you like, that counts. So there's the regime. The regime is asking. It's asking you. You need to demonstrate these criteria. I suppose a piece of performance engineered glass can do all kinds of things. We could use it in ways it wasn't intended and so on. But somehow it's locked into as well this other apparatus of certification and so on, that means only parts of its kind of capacities are even kind of recognizable. So I'm. Does that sort of I don't know if that makes sense.
So does that fall into the logic of a kind of would that be like a critique of standardization, whereas Simondon was almost kind of enthusiastic about standardization as something that kind of made technical objects universal in a way? I
Yeah, I think in this case it would be a critique. Yeah.
Can I add something? I
Mm.
was just wondering, at the end of your talk, Katie, you were mentioning the different kinds of use, and I was waiting. In the end, I would add like the idea of the open object, and I was missing also the very important concept of margin of indeterminacy. So how would you relate? Because there's a big step. At the end of technical mentality, Simondon used the idea of architecture to prove his argument. So how architecture could be more open and so. But then you move from the architecture in general as a form, you move it to matter, to the material. So I would like to ask you, is it useful? How would you deal with the concept of an open object, which I think you are really, looking at when you are dealing with these relations and this way of defining, because then you proved already the la chaîne opératoire. Everything is there. You prove to us there's a lot of things behind the material. But then with the material, how would you deal with this idea of indeterminacy? And would it be possible to work with materials with this indeterminacy? And what would be an open object in this sense?
So I always think it's interesting in a way that the brick example in Simondon doesn't, we don't even get to firing the brick, we certainly don't get it, we don't get anywhere near it in a wall so there's sort of, it stops at that point. And I think in a way this also the book sort of slightly stops at that point too. And is technical mentality the one where he talks about La Tourette? And he's really interested there in the sort of in the way that there's a register in the concrete, isn't there, of its making, of its process. He's quite interested in that, I think. And I find more exciting the sort of in the Orange book, the sort of the descriptions of the vaults and all of these kind of drawings of different kinds of vaults that can be made and different arches. So there's something open in the kind of in the sort of in the forms you can in the forms that you can produce. And the La Tourette one, I find it so I wanted to, there was one example I wanted to show. So some of the work that I've done has been on fabric form work. So this is when you have a flexible mold instead of a rigid mold. And there's a particularly beautiful example that I've written about sometimes where this mold is in a jig, which itself is flexible, so that the team, as they're working with the concrete, they're pouring the concrete into the top of the mold. They're tightening it and loosening it as they like together as a team. In fact, and of course, the concrete registers all the things I was talking about as being kind of ironed out. And for me, that's where I'm not sure if it's an open object once it's finished, but as a term this to me is a kind of an inventive way of working with materials. So there's and that's a sort of true openness, if you like, to possibility where so and we were looking kind of at this film of glass of in fact they're making laboratory glass instruments, but it's this kind of dance between people who are heating the glass, two men who are sort of almost who are stretching it and so on.
Okay, do you think we can, is there time to show a bit of that? Because it is so beautiful.
Have you got it up on the screen? Have you got it?
I can probably find it from the Twitter thing. Let me have a quick look. I'll have a quick look, right?
I'm sure I can find it too. Yeah, so I suppose it's how do you, the question somehow is how do you move on from the idea of the register of the process to the process itself being inventive, the process of engaging with the materials. Have you found it, Cécile?
Let's just tell you that
I found it. I'll share it.
Okay, great.
And after we could have some we have questions from Jean Group, and it would be a pleasure.
Right.
So, in fact, this is very nice. It's from Newcastle.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I think that's it, yeah? There we go.
In fact, in the full version of the film, they also build oh, I'm getting feedback. They also build a...
Sorry, I'll switch off my mic, right?
Yeah, they also build a the longer version, the full version. They also build a kiln out of wet clay as well, but with no mold. So they just sort of build this kiln for heating the glass.
So I know there's another question from Jim. I just wanted to ask. Sorry, but I want to switch off the Bluetooth. I just wanted to ask if you think about the specification, the performance specification of industrialized or standardized glass, and then you see the really alluring kind of contact with the glass by these craftsmen who know exactly what they're doing. Can you put words to what is, I guess, in this critique of performance specification, which on the one hand is necessary for large scale constructions, but what is it that's lost that could be recuperated, and what if it can be recuperated, can it intelligently inform the kinds of cities that we're building, the kind of big scale that we have to think in? You're frozen. I don't know what happened. Katie, you're frozen for me. I can't. You're all frozen.
No, it's normal. For me, it's normal. Kate, if you wanna answer, your mic is mute. Still muted, dear.
Can you hear us, Katie?
Yeah. So maybe there would be other questions that we'd have to ask about why we are building all those big glass buildings with performance engineered glass, and who is benefiting from it. And I don't think there's a necessity for it. So I don't think we need to do it, is the answer. But I was also thinking that was interesting about watching that clip and the conversation about standardization, because they're basically, they're making the same thing over and over and over again. So there's also something important in that as well. It's not kind of truly a creative process in this case.
Yeah, I guess the major difference between a very industrialized process is that although they look like they are the same, if you compare it to standardized processes, they're probably extremely variegated, each of these pieces.
Probably you're right. Yeah.
If they're scientific instruments, then they can't be that variegated. I think they still have to be kind of quite precise, but yeah, so it would require, in a way, what I guess the nature of my question is there a logic in scaling back? Like we can standardize and performance specify materials so that we can build things that we couldn't build before, but are you saying that actually we shouldn't try to build things that we couldn't build before, and we should go back to a kind of artisanal relationship with material?
No, I don't think I'm saying that, and I don't think I have a proposal particularly either. But but performance specification suits. It suits contractors. It's a way of leaving decisions about what you use to make things open, so that basically you can make as much profit as possible. So you don't. And it's also about avoiding litigation. So it's about not taking responsibility for the material choices you make as well. So sort of passing the buck. So I'm not convinced at all that it's there. It's there for any greater purpose, really. So.
Thiago, you said there were also questions from the Jim.
Yes, from the audience. Thank you. I'm gonna read it to you, okay? Jim Shrub, who presented with us animations, Marx, Simondon, and Après. He made a comment here and a question. Hello everyone, I hope you're well. I was wondering if or how energy positive buildings changed architects' conceptions of their work in relation to materials, for instance, time or anything else. And he explains, I'm thinking about things like the function, place of the concept of degradation, the new inscription of buildings in a techno-geography, and the socio-technical milieu, for instance, if that helps. The idea of degradation and this positive energy buildings, if it changed architects' conception of their work and relation to materials.
Yeah, I suppose this is kind of a question about thinking of materials and buildings as having some kind of a life cycle of thinking of materials coming from somewhere, of changing, of degrading, decaying, of them having embodied energy. And yes, I think it's made an enormous difference, and perhaps then the sort of the interest in here is in how you need to, is in whether you still have the same, if you still have the same sort of conceptual frameworks and techniques that you had, the same ways of drawing, the same ways of describing things, or whatever you're limited to by the sort of professional setup. It makes it more difficult to look at those issues, but probably but it's exactly in these sorts of discourses that you'll find much more attention being paid to materials. Yeah, so thanks for the question.
If I may, I would like also to add a question to Cecile's presentation. First, a comment, very interesting. I find it quite intriguing, because Cecile has developed a presentation I was present about pure information, if I'm right, and now you brought to us a very special quote about pure nature, and then it's a kind of very, very sensitive way of doing research. I mean, you choose really, one word, one special moment, and then you make a very interesting reflection. So I would like to hear about, if you are interested in make this comparison between pure information and pure nature. And also, if I may, because your presentation made me think about the recent work of Yuki Hui, who's really concerned about the cosmotechnology, cosmopolitics, and so. And I miss in his work sometimes the things like when Kate was presenting the very idea of alienation, technical alienation, open objects, margin of indeterminacy, and so. And so, how could we deal with this cosmological approach, and with the different ones? Because that's the main point, to have different approach to technology to face this monopolic way of approaching the progress and so. But then, are we really concerned about the different ways technical alienation affects different cultures? And if we are, how could it be possible to overcome these technical alienations? I mean, you just made a question about going back to artisanal way of doing things, and Kate was saying, no, it's not, it's not like this, but we should look for this magical unity somehow. But then somehow, I believe it could really, provide us with a reflection on this pure information and raw nature and cosmotechnical approach. An opening conversation.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to be mentioned in the same sentence as Yukoi. As I am also so incredibly humbled to be here with you and with Katie today. It's so exciting. And just to say, when I asked about this kind of reverse gear, that's not what the feeling I had when I started reading your book. And it just occurred to me as you were talking that I thought maybe I got this wrong. And I was relieved that you said, no, you didn't get this wrong. It's a problem, but it needs to be, it's open to thinking through still what our relation with materials needs to be. The idea of pure information, it's true that the pure information and nature brute, they're both expressions that I used only once, but that I thought were critical, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I still think so. The problem with the idea of pure information is that I can't remember what I wrote in this article. I might contradict myself now if I go back to this. It seems to me though that it also had something to do with the apeiron and with a kind of absolute indeterminacy that links up with an interest that I have developed otherwise also by chance in the notion of information entropy as something that if conceived from a different angle than that of engineering, and if conceived in absolute terms, would be indistinguishable from absolute indeterminacy, and therefore indistinguishable from what we often call noise. But that's that's a different story that should be told another time. The link between the two, I think, what I discovered when I wrote this this thing about the birds of the apocalypse, and surprised myself in a way that in order to get over this, I needed to look at what was meant with nature. So this nature techniques divide the dichotomy between the two. I needed to look at the notion of nature more specifically, and so this kind of faceting that you have on the one hand of a structural regime of entities, on the geographical environment, for instance, or you could say that about some materials that haven't been processed yet. There are also regimes of elements to a certain extent that then you manipulate to become, if you like, docile to the function that you want to impose on them, more or less, or amenable to the functionality that you want to give it. So you have the structure on the one hand, then you have this understanding that is really rather functional, as nature being something that lends itself to individuation, to the idea of essence, as when you inquire into this is actually the most frequent use of the word nature, it seems to me, in Simondon, is when he refers to the nature of things as their essence. But he does, and I think he actually catapults Aristotelian metaphysics in a much more fundamental way there than the hylomorphism criticism, which is also very important because he basically dismantles the simplicity of form matter as, or dismantling, what's the right word? He kind of uncovers it, I guess, as a con. It's like you don't know what you're talking about because you haven't really thought about the processes involved in the relationship between form and matter, and what matter, the fact that matter is already informed of its own accord. And in this idea of the nature of things and human nature, it then occurred to me that something much more radical than just nature as what lends itself to individuation, as what is pre-individual in the sense that it is prone to individuation. When he talks about the apeiron, it's not the same thing when you refer to the unlimited as a kind of primordial unity of all that is, and that is, open to phase shifts. And if this primordial unity is also the same as an absolute indifferentiation or indeterminacy, like you were saying, then really that's something that we have in common, not only with the materials that we then, bend to our specific purposes, but with the different humans that we can become. So it's not that it's not based on qualities or bundles of qualities that have a certain duration throughout time by which we can recognize a human being as, as an individual or as of a gender or a race or whatever. It's actually what we have in common universally is this indeterminacy of being human, and which happens to be also the kind of primordial indistinction of all that is. I think that's quite powerful. I like it very much. If I remember well, the idea of pure information also went kind of in that direction, but I have to read the article again. That's bad, isn't it? But my memory is not my friend. I'm sure it is, though. Maybe it's better to forget some things.
Well, we're still open. We still have some time if you're available. And Diego, Fabiano, anyone from the audience, if you'd like to send us any questions, we are happy to make them. And yes, but then let me add again, because I'm really I'm playing the role here also as a researcher. It's an opportunity, golden opportunity with you too. And but please, yes, I'm interested in this. I would insist in this technical alienation problem, as I see as a political thing that Simondon was really, because we had this amazing roundtable with Jim and Jean-Luc Morisseau and Cécile, and we have been discussing a little bit about alienations and the gistone, le numérique, and so. And Kate just provided us with an amazing presentation about materials and architecture, which is really engaged in this whole capitalist system. And then, do we have a margin of indeterminacy to really look after? I mean, to really overcome again the term, overcome this alienation that capitalism and because Jim just gave us an insight saying, okay, and then now let's build technogeography and as an additional concept to think with. So what would be the additional concepts that we could add to disciplines like architecture, or maybe thinking about our work together, Cécile, the multi-species spectrum approach? What would be the different concepts that we could add to our reflection to face technical alienation, if you understand, as one of the main problems we have in our societies?
Actually, can I just kind of give a quick extension of what I said earlier, because you asked me about alienation and I kind of got stuck in the first half of the answer. The initial title that we had, the initial title that we had suggested, that of disadaptation. I was thinking about a part in Simondon's text on information, form, and potential, where he gives the example just before talking about pre-revolutionary states. He talks about the child, the newborn child that is born, that falls into a pattern of sleep, and then before having changing the pattern of sleep, there's a moment where everything is confused and the child wakes up at random hours, and then there's another pattern where the child can sleep longer and the digestive tract, I suppose, matures, and then there are moments when the child reaches a kind of saturation of their motor schema, so they've learned how to crawl but they don't know how to walk yet, and rather than progressing or adapting slowly from crawling, improving the crawling until it is walking, you have a moment of disadaptation where there's no movement possible and frustration and confusion, and then the child gets up and walks and has this complete recasting of their motor schema and understanding of their kind of bipedal capabilities. And this disadaptation from the functions that we acquire, I think in a way this resonates with this performance specification. I don't know how yet exactly. The more we specify and specialize in a way that could lead to hypertely, which means that although we're kind of specializing and ever more tightly correlating our adaptation to something in particular, we also lose the generality of all the potentials that were inherent in us. So this hypertely or hyper-specialization becomes a form of alienation from the ground, and this ground being ultimately the apeiron as something that would be the maximal indeterminacy within us. It's never absolute, because we are already specialized by evolution to be as human beings with certain constraints, but it is certainly much greater than the adaptations that we've produced so far. So if you like, the disadaptation would be something like a neoteny, where you give up certain schemas of functioning and kind of specifications in order to kind of reload your capacity to completely recast your operational schema. I don't know if I'm explaining myself here. So in a way, I guess with disadaptation, I was thinking about alienation. If I think of it, I'm going to make it as complicated as it is in my head. If any form of specification is alienation from our maximal indeterminacy, from all that we could be, because the moment you become something, you specify what you can be. So you're alienating yourself from this ground of indeterminacy. But indeterminacy in general, we perceive this to be an alienation. It's different from what we already are and from what we already know. So if you like, if we are now alienated, I think it's because we're alienated from ground. But if we were to choose a certain reload of this indeterminacy, it would certainly be lived by many people as something alienating, unless you think that it's a good thing and that you have a kind of trust that you'll fall on your feet, that you can, give up your specifications and reload differently. I don't know. I'm really just telling you what's going through my mind, but it does matter to me. But I can tell that it's not coming out as clear as. In fact, it's not that clear in my mind yet.
It seems that Thiago has had technical problems. It sometimes happens. So I saw, Katie, I saw that you were going to say something, but you were muted.
No, I was just going. So it's alienation as also having a potential, a place of potential, a sort of
So it's like being able to consider alienation two ways. Alienation from the kind of maximal degree of potentiality that reduces itself the more you specify. And on the other hand, the fact that we're creatures of habit, and we think that things are what they are now, and that they are defined by what they are rather than what they can be. And therefore, if you retract from this and kind of reload your capability to be otherwise, that is a problem for us, I guess, to the extent that all of us also cling to the idea that it would be comfortable if things stay a bit what they were and what we were used to.
It's a very powerful idea, and it's been this kind of there was all this hope, I suppose, with the pandemic, wasn't there? There was all this hope that might be, in fact, what happened. maybe there's still residual of And for you, is that going against Simondon then to make that suggestion?
For me, the suggestion of it's my. I mean, I may be misinterpreting him, but it's the conclusions I draw, the consequences I see in him saying that alienation is an alienation from ground rather than just from the fruit of our labor.
Oh, well, again, just to add, I mean, maybe to help, the very concept of technogeography, for example, and do you believe, Kate, for example, that is it becoming more interesting? It's more something that architects are looking for, to the best place to build and to engage with other, instead of just building what we call in general the white elephant. It doesn't matter where and how. I think that was the main issue by Jim, and I was trying to think about the additional concepts that we could. Of course, Cécile just brought to us the very philosophical alienation question, and it's quite interesting. I'm really thinking about it. Just to precise, I believe the very idea of disadaptation is present in the complementary notes of the individuation. So if anyone is interested, I think Simondon explains very carefully that we adapt as much as we disadapt. And I think that's the main question by Cécile about alienation. But I was running back a little bit about the material thing and the question by Jim. So are architectures, are they trying to disalienate the markets and the projects and themselves by using alternative concepts like technogeography or designing process of materials, what would be the concepts that would help us to overcome this alienation that's basically the capitalist way of building everything?
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I haven't come across the term technogeography before, so I'll look it up after the session. But that means I can't really answer to that at all. But I'm thinking of some of, maybe I'm just thinking of some of the things which I don't think this is this isn't conceptual, but some of the things which just disrupt some of the procedures that I look at in terms of specifying materials. And so, for example, interestingly, using specific materials disrupts the possibility of specification. So when people, for example, use reuse materials, you would have to devise a different way of talking about what you're doing. You can't just go for a generic or a standard sort of mode of specification. You sort of have to start actually inventing the way that you do that as well. And similarly, I mean, just using, if people start sort of using experimental materials, things which haven't been codified or approved and so on. And sometimes then you just see different ways of organizing things on site. So building workers might start devising own solutions, or different kinds of negotiations and discussions might happen between people on site than this kind of than the expected one of the architect coming up with the design and the somebody else executing it, and someone else sort of approving it, if you like. So I think there are all kinds of there seem to be a whole range of ways of actually disrupting those procedures, which produce other sets of social relations and other ways of doing things on site. So, and I think it's kind of interesting that that literally the materials or the techniques or the technologies can do that. I don't think that's quite what you're asking me, but it's really interesting looking at the moments where those systems stop working and don't work anymore, and then something else comes and emerges instead. Yeah, so
So yes, please. We are it's 12:31 here in Brazil. And well, I'm pleased to say that it has been an amazing conversation. And I would like to ask you if no questions are available now, and if you'd like to make a final comment, and thanking you all for your presence and your conference.
Well, thank you for letting us reconnect with Katie. Continue a conversation we left suspended so many years ago when we were in a completely different place to think about it.
And sometimes it's such a great pleasure just sort of being in a space where you can think and talk about Simondon's work. I'm sort of always astounded by just how rich it is, and to be with people who are reading it in such sort of profound and deep levels. It's really fabulous. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Thiago, and everybody else involved in organizing this.
How many more sessions?
Good question, Katie. Recently, Diego just mentioned that it's an infinite seminar because we are still trying to add a few roundtables with a few guests, and so. But we planned it so far 25, so we still have 9, I think, to go. But I believe we will manage to do a few more. So yeah, for the sake of our time. But yes, and I must thank to all the organizing committee. So Fabiano, Diego, Carol, Pablo, and Veronica, Maria Fernanda, and Lucas Vilalta. And yes, we are quite a small team doing many connections and improving this international network, because we started with this Latin America, but now, I mean, with the presence of you and the other guests, we are really confident that we can open Simondonian thinking. We can improve, and it will be available on YouTube, and we'll download the video and discuss, and so maybe do some transcriptions and maybe do some publications, but then it's all afterwards, I mean, post-production. But yes, would you like to say anything, you guys, Diego and Fabiano, please?
No, I just thank you both for this wonderful session. I think there are many beautiful connections, and I think they connect to other roundtables we've already had, and some that are coming. I think next week we're going to have one precisely about the pre-individual and nature. So I think we've already had a taste of what's coming next week with Cécile's presentation. And of course, materiality is something that appears in at least half the presentation. So we've had a taste of that too. So I think it was a wonderful occasion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you as well.
Say bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you later.
See you later.